Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give everybody just a minute to get online here, and then we will get started. Thanks for joining, everyone. We will get started here shortly. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the September 2024 PQA Quality Essentials webinar. My name is Amanda Ryan. I'm the Director of Education here at PQA, and I will be your host for today's webinar, which features a roundtable discussion about the Specialty Pharmacy Turnaround Time Pharmacy Measure Implementation Pilot. Before we get started, I'd like to walk you through a few housekeeping items. First, please do submit your questions to us during the presentation today. Anytime throughout the webinar, you can use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will answer as many questions as we have time for during the roundtable discussion portion of the webinar. Also, the webinar recording and the slide deck will be available to PQA members. Both of those will be available within about a week at the Member Resources Library section of the PQA website. We will also post a recording of today's webinar on PQA's YouTube channel. And then finally, I'd like everyone to please consider completing the survey that will populate when you leave the webinar today. It takes about 1 minute, and it really does help us to use your feedback to develop our future programming. And with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to today's roundtable speakers. We've got a wide variety of voices, and we'll have a great discussion for you today. First, we have Heather Gibson, who is Director of Performance Measurement at PQA. Next is Johnny Chau, who is the Clinical Operations Manager at Kaiser Permanente National Specialty Pharmacy. Then we have Mike Duteau, who is President of Noble Health Services. Also with us is Heather Kirkham, Director of Health Analytics, Research and Reporting at Walgreen Co. Next is Drew Mascolino, Managing Director, Therapeutic Resource Center, Product Strategy at Accredo. And finally, we have Ryan Nix, Senior Director of Operations, Specialty Pharmacy Program at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Thanks to all of you for being with us here today. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Before we dive in, I do want to thank Pfizer. PQA received funding from Pfizer to support our specialty pharmacy turnaround time, or SP-TAT-PH implementation pilot. We also use general funds to support this work, and we do not endorse, recommend, or favor any organization or its products or services. So once again, thank you to them for their support on this pilot. And so before we get into the roundtable, we wanted to provide you all with a little bit of background on what this pilot was all about. So in 2020, guided by some stakeholder input, PQA drafted our Pharmacy Measure Development Action Plan, or the plan. The plan outlined the next steps for developing measure concepts that were prioritized based on their feasibility, their data source availability and usability, or their likelihood for marketplace adoption. The plan was also informed by 3 primary inputs, being a CPF-PQA collaboration. We had a Pharmacy Measures Measure Concept Advisory Group, as well as stakeholder interviews. And through all of that, we were able to prioritize some measure concepts that fell on a spectrum of feasibility, being high and most ready for measure development, moderate, meaning we would need a little bit of research ahead of time, and then low, meaning that there would be some longer term action needed before we could prime a measure concept for development. But really, our efforts to standardizing turnaround time started even earlier than that. In 2017, in collaboration with NASP, we identified and prioritized specialty pharmacy measure concepts for development. And from that, in 2018, we had a specialty pharmacy workshop where these measure concepts were evaluated with different specialty pharmacies, and turnaround time ended up being highly rated as a measure concept. Then from 2018 through 2019, PQA entered the measure specification phase, and so we took the specialty pharmacy turnaround time measure concept, we developed some measure specifications, and then we convened a task force to help us further refine those measure specifications. Then from 2019 through 2020, the draft measure underwent measure testing, and so we pulled up the data. We had some measure testing partners. They looked at the measure against their data, and that informed the rest of the measure's development. Then in 2020 through 2021, we also had a research project to identify facilitators and barriers that can impact turnaround time. And while this was happening in 2021, we had a measure review. So the SP-TAT-PH measure was reviewed and approved by our quality metrics expert panel to move forward for endorsement consideration by our membership. And then later that year, the measure was endorsed by our PQA membership, which is a very exciting time for us. And then from 2022 through 2024, we conducted an implementation pilot to advance standardized measurement of turnaround time to learn more about the real world use of this measure. And so we're excited to present the work of that to you all today. And so just a quick look at the measure itself. So the description of this measure is the average number of days between a specialty pharmacy receiving a new prescription for a specialty medication and the prescription being ready for pickup or scheduled for delivery. So the denominator for this one is going to be the total number of new prescriptions for medications included within our medication table. Exclusions are prescriptions that received a refill too soon error upon adjudication. And the numerator for this measure is the sum of turnaround time in days for all prescriptions included in the denominator. And so this measure uses dispensing system or clinical or care management system data, and it is intended for performance measurement for specialty pharmacies. And the aims for our implementation project were really to implement a standardized turnaround time measure, to provide some benchmarking reports to highlight opportunities for improvement and facilitate best practice sharing. We also wanted to evaluate the measure use and refine the specifications as needed, and then document and disseminate promising practices designed to improve turnaround time. And the pilot really followed these 5 buckets of implement, validate, benchmark, inform, and refine. So again, we were implementing the measure. We had 5 specialty pharmacy organizations partner with us, and they represented a variety of specialty pharmacy types, independents, health systems or IDNs, chain, and PBM operated specialty pharmacies. We then, and I'm going to describe this in a little bit on the next slide, we did a validation process by which our partners calculated the measures results, and then we validated them. We also provided de-identified reports so that we could understand how performance compared across the specialty pharmacies. We then hosted some interactive promising practice sharing forums with our participants in order to really document some best practices and any findings that we can include in our final report and manuscript. And finally, we're going to refine the measure as needed. We're going to leverage our consensus-based measure maintenance process after evaluation of the specifications, should we decide that there are some refinements that we can make, they would follow our consensus-based process. And so a little bit more about our validation process. For this pilot, it was really important to validate the measure results to ensure accurate interpretation and calculation of the measure rates. Not only so we can be confident in the results, but also so we could identify opportunities to further clarify and standardize the measure specifications. So we provided all of our partners with the measure specifications and value sets for use. Our partners then used their data to calculate the measures, and they transmitted some raw de-identified data to us as well. That way we could take the data they provide us, calculate the measures on our own, and compare the results. From there, us and our participants would each sit down, look at any of the discrepancies that we identified through the validation process, and work to reconcile them together. And this was really an iterative process that we would do until we achieved a really high % of agreement on the results. And we, had really great success throughout the pilot with measure validation. Our partners were really awesome to work with. And so we were excited with everything that we learned throughout. And we're really excited to share that with you guys today. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to have a roundtable panel discussion. And so while we're doing this, please submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Once we wrap up with some of our discussion, we're going to turn to that and see if there's any additional questions that came up that we can talk through with you all. So at this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. My panelists could come up and turn their cameras on. All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank our panelists here for joining me today on the roundtable. I learned a lot from all of them during this collaboration on the SP-TAT-PH implementation pilot, and I'm really excited to have them share more about their experience participating in the pilot with you all. So to start us off, can you each tell us a little bit about your experience implementing the measure? And we're going to start this off with Johnny.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I believe in terms of the experience that the Kaiser Permanente National Specialty Pharmacy had in implementing the PQA-TAT measure really was a great experience. Our accreditation that we had, our specialty pharmacy accreditation, really provided us a good baseline or foundation on implementing the measure. So it was really basically aligning the nomenclature between and reconciling between the two entities and to really fine tune those criteria. So that allowed us to really kind of adjust or look at the start and stop goals, as well as a really deep dive into the outliers and where the visibility they provide in terms of how they impacted turnaround time for specialty pharmacy. But it's very much different from our traditional pharmacy, where it's a first in, first out. So we have to really look into those outliers to identify the bigger impact, the biggest impact. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think we had a similar experience, I think, to what Johnny mentioned. We've implemented other measures, and because of our accreditation requirements, right? This is something we're not new to, and so with that experience, I think it went really smoothly as far as implementing the new measure. We were able to rely on that sort of previous experience. Similar to kind of what Johnny went over, I think there are some different data points, right, that are defined slightly different. So those slight discrepancies, right, make you have to kind of go back and sort of remap some of your previous work. So thinking about, turnaround time over weekends, right, and how does that kind of relay to how that impacts your turnaround time. Other than those slight remapping, though, I mean, it was, again, a really sort of smooth, seamless implementation process on our side.
Yeah,
I can go next.
Go ahead, Drew.
Thanks, Mike. I can go next. Yeah, I think I'd echo what Ryan and Johnny said too. I'd applaud PQA for taking this on. Certainly, I believe strongly, and we believe strongly at Accredo, that turnaround time is a very important metric to measure. We've been measuring it for years, and kind of like Ryan said, we have our own way of measuring it, and we of course have customers that measure it differently too as well. And I think a big undertaking to try to create a standardized approach that works for all the different types of pharmacies and customers that we're trying to tackle here. So I know we'll probably get into some of the details of it later, but yeah, I think the specifications were really relatively easy to implement and adapt. There was definitely some nuances, and as Johnny said, I had a mentor many years ago tell me that averages lie. So you got to dig in to the data set and find those outliers and really understand really what's kind of going on in that population. So yeah, but overall, great experience and real happy to be a part of it. I think it's a very important metric that we should all be measuring. So sorry, Mike, it's to step on you. Thanks.
Actually, I'll let Heather go next.
Happy to. Thank you, Mike. Similar to all of the other speakers, we similarly started with our previous measure from a data perspective and used that code to adapt and understand and compare to the new PQA measure. I think our biggest challenge was similar to what some of the other speakers mentioned, which was it was a little bit nuanced, especially the concept of profile time. Within the measure wasn't something that we naturally capture in our data system. So we spent a lot of time in that iterative process that Heather Gibson mentioned, trying to refine that proxy. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, thank you. So again, very similar with everybody else. For us, it was not a new concept, and I was unique and fortunate in the sense that I was on the board of directors of PQA when this started to come to fruition. So I actually saw it as it was evolving, and then I had the opportunity internally with my own company to transition over into specialty. So it became much more relevant and important for me at that point in time. We were a little bit different in the sense that we were calculating things differently. Our patient assistance and our manufacturer copay team was actually dragging down our number, if you will, based on how we were capturing and reporting that. So profile time was certainly an issue for us also. But at the end of the day, this was certainly something that was easy to comprehend, easy to implement, and I think very straightforward to work within the guidelines. So very happy to be part of the process and very pleased with the results.
Well, thank you all for sharing a little bit. When it comes to the differences in definitions that you all spoke to, I think that really highlights the importance of standardized measurement, especially for pharmacies, so that they're not measuring one thing potentially 5 different ways with 5 different partners, that they're really consistent in that implementation that can help ease burden. With that too, having had experience already in your pharmacies with measuring turnaround time, can you share a little bit about the communications that supported this pilot? For example, what information were you sharing with your pharmacy teams about the pilot goals, and how were interventions aimed at improving turnaround time captured? I don't know, Heather, can you kick us off with that, please?
Sure, happy to, Heather. So when we first implemented turnaround time for URAC many years ago, the stores received extensive communications via multiple different avenues, including scorecards and action planning and many other methods. Given that Walgreens already actively used the URAC measure, this pilot was more about understanding the nuances between the measures to determine if there are any operational considerations if we were to adopt the new measure. Individual pharmacies were not specifically informed about the pilot, though the pharmacy leadership really encouraged our participation.
Thanks so much, Heather. Ryan, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think ours was similar, right? We talked about, we've been implementing turnaround time for a while, so it's something that we've got dashboards and things that we look at. I will say, as others have mentioned, some of the nuances, right, between profile time, gave us some additional data to kind of look at and try to weed through. So sometimes, from an operational standpoint, looking back, we did look into, gosh, why is this holding us down? Maybe we're not defining this right, or maybe we're not capturing sort of the metric as was intended. Our goals to staff, though, have always remained the same, right? As we want to eliminate the barriers. We try to highlight, hey, these are the barriers that seem to be dragging us down, right? These seem to be the things that may be causing challenges. I think it was Mike, right, talked about or financial assistance, right? What are the things internally, right, that are maybe causing our turnaround time to go up, that are delaying our patients from getting the care that we'd like to deliver? And so a lot of the communication was more kind of on the external side, right? Reinforcing the guidance that we've already given to our team of ensuring that, our turnaround time is what we want it to be. With maybe just a little bit deeper dive into some of the things that popped up, right, with having to calibrate to a new set of metrics.
And I think, from our perspective, very similar to everybody else, we rolled it out with meetings and follow-up support materials. I think if there's one thing that we could have done differently in hindsight, it's the fact that we were going through a rapid growth period at that time, and we had onboarded a large number of new members to our prior authorization team. So while a lot of what we were sharing again was overkill for some of our veteran members, we could have circled back to some of the newer members and maybe done individual assessments to make sure that they were where they needed to be. So I think we identified it quickly enough, but we should have done it differently from the start.
Yeah, I think, Mike, to your point, we certainly heard throughout the pilot that staff normalization after COVID and its impacts has really impacted turnaround time positively, allowing, more team members to do more and be more focused on, like you said, you're expanding your prior authorization team. Johnny, Drew, anything you guys would like to add about the communications that help to support this pilot within your organizations?
Sure, I can address that. I think we were just informing our teams that the work was being observed and looked at. And in terms of a test of change for their particular workflow, we wanted to make sure it's as consistent as possible. So that was the messaging. Because the workflow for specialty pharmacies can be very much a spider web and not very much linear. And because of that, we wanted to make sure that there were consistencies across the workflow. So we stressed a lot of that. But overall, it wasn't really a big test of change for our staff. And knowing our type A pharmacists and technicians out there, they were going to try to game that system a little bit. So we just said, just continue as normal, and really kind of work on the consistency piece so that there's some value and some learnings that come out of this project and effort.
Yeah, I don't think I have much more to add there to the others, Heather. I mean, I will say that, as a national mail order specialty pharmacy, right, we're structured a little bit different than some of the others here. So it's, instead of, potentially locations, right, we're more focused nationally, and we focus more on disease state in terms of how we, delineate our pharmacy teams, under Accredo. So I also mentioned earlier that turnaround time is a measure that we've been measuring for years, and we have continuous improvement efforts, always ongoing to improve turnaround time. So very easy to communicate and talk to the teams about this initiative here. So really very positive.
Yeah, thank you so much, Drew. Ryan, thinking of improvements and optimizing turnaround time, are you able to describe any interventions that sort of facilitated improved turnaround times at your pharmacies? And then maybe any of the others on the panel want to share an experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest changes that we made on our side is, looking at it from an operational perspective, we did put a renewed focus on, ensuring that we have multiple modalities available to reach our patients. So a big focus, right, for our group is making sure when we're talking to patients that we have their preferred method of communication up front. We now have, like, to date, we've tried to engage patients electronically, right, meet them where they want to be met. And so we've got about a third of our patients who have elected into saying that they prefer through our patient portal, right, or electronic communication, essentially. And so after we saw this movement, right, to this electronic refill request, we really saw an improvement in turnaround times and reporting for these patients. It was neat to kind of see, because you not only saw for our orthostatic hypertensive patients, we would ask them on the phone, how's everything going? How do you think your medication's working? But being able to get responses back of, like, oh, here's a log of my last, month worth of blood pressure readings, right? That's incredibly valuable to our clinical pharmacists and folks that are caring for these patients. So being able to get that right is helpful, and it also speeds up the turnaround time. So being able to address patients' problems. I think overall, we have a little bit different model, right? So kind of comparing to some of the other panelists, in that we have a pharmacist that's at Vanderbilt. We have a pharmacist that's embedded in our clinics and works on site. And so that on-site presence, we noticed, right, sped up our turnaround time of being able to go into a patient's room, right, or clinic appointment and say, hey, this is the next step, right, with getting you on this complicated therapy. I'm going to be reaching out to you on XYZ date, right, to talk about next steps, because this is not a medication, right, where you're going to walk out of it today with it. We've got some background and legwork that we've got to do. So recognizing, right, that that's not an option for everybody that's listening to this. I think what we've continued to stress to our patients is making sure that with our staff is making sure that every interaction with patients, you're getting as much as you can, right, out of that interaction, and that you're setting expectations with patients of, hey, I'm going to communicate with you, even like this is my phone number, right, getting those communication modality preferences up front. I know I'm in that generation, right, where if I don't recognize the phone number, I'm not answering that call. And so it helps to sort of set those expectations up front. The final point I'll make is just, I think we noticed that as we're digging through our turnaround times, that having staff that are dedicated to specific disease states, you see it in the data behind the scenes, right? But those patient populations generally have a faster turnaround time from the date of prescription until the patient has it in hand. So I think expertise, it just goes to speak that expertise goes a long way, right, in improving the speed and the time that it takes to deliver medication to a patient.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Heather, I see you're off mute.
I am. I really Ryan's description really resonated with me about, first of all, digging into the data. Walgreens first used this data to really identify outliers. Somebody else mentioned outliers earlier on the call. So by which I mean where turnaround time is notably higher, either by a mean or a mode. And then we looked at those outliers for patterns such as disease state, plan, provider, drug classes, to see which factors are within the pharmacy's control. For example, we think through ways to improve prior authorization processes, such as EMR access for an individual store, or better communications for financial assistance. One advantage that we have that's similar to Ryan's description is that we have our local presence, specifically locally trained billing techs, which really helped us to tailor to local plans and provider needs. The data also helps us identify if there are any individual stores that need additional access to, say, LDDs or changes to their inventory on hand.
Awesome, thank you.
And I can also add, one of our challenges was certainly in the prior authorization side with physicians, right? I think we can all acknowledge there are some offices who love the assistants and they work with us really closely, and there are others who have their own teams, and those numbers look different in most cases. So where we focused midpoint through this process was we added like an internal concierge, mainly for new provider offices that weren't necessarily doing part of the process, but they were following up with their team to ensure that we were properly supporting. And we noticed in those cases, the turnaround times improved. And it really came down to communication.
Yeah, I think we can all agree. Increasing the communication between pharmacies and providers is critical to patient care, because often your patient is there at the pharmacy a lot more often than they are at the physician office. And so there's more opportunity for intervention there at the pharmacy. And if the pharmacist can identify an issue or a potential issue with a prescription, being able to communicate with the physician and resolve that quickly is really for the betterment of the patient ultimately. Can anyone on the panel, perhaps, we've been talking about, specific clinical areas, specific diseases, being able to drill down and figure out, for a specific disease, do they have longer turnaround time and how can we target them to improve that? Is there an example of where measuring turnaround time helped benefit a specific patient population or improve performance of a specific medication category relative to turnaround time?
I'm happy to jump in on this one too, Heather. So our example is during a recent new drug launch. We used the turnaround time measure to both ensure high quality patient care as well as a provider experience. We used weekly stand-up meetings to identify any challenges in successfully adjudicating claims for patients. And then we shared out with the rest of the specialty pharmacy network how to overcome some of those barriers, which allowed us to reduce turnaround time. And these efforts collectively benefited individual patients, as well as they pleased providers and really supported our pharma partner in the launch of that new drug.
Yeah, I think we had a similar story. Like we, as we're looking at turnaround time, one of the things that we noticed and our providers noticed, particularly maybe like in the IBD space, is that many of these patients are starting on some sort of infused induction dose, and then they move into maybe a subcutaneous self-administered dose. There was a lot of lag, we noticed, right, between the induction dose and when the patient self-administers, because most of the time you're talking about multiple different teams, right, that are involved with this. There's a provider's office that has to get the medication, right, and then they have to turn it over to a specialty pharmacy who's going to kind of take the reins. Through sort of evaluating turnaround time and sort of highlighting that space, we were able to kind of see points of where's the breakdown happening with that, right? What's going on, and that, somehow we do the induction dose. There's a lot of, payer preferences that mean patient may not even be able to get their induction dose at the provider's office. They may have to go to an outside source. So now you're introducing a third party right into this. And so we built a quality improvement program around sort of coordinating that as a part of our specialty pharmacy, of ensuring from induction to maintenance, it was maintained by one team. And so I think that it highlighted really a great sort of example on our end of where we were able to kind of take turnaround time, take the data and the information it was presenting us with something that we didn't expect, right? And build a quality program around figuring out what's happening with these patients and how do we really improve this.
I think for our experience that we did identify that in our particular IPF population, that there was a lot of safety parameters or laboratory parameters that were needed to be followed up on, and having pharmacists kind of chase wasn't really an optimal use of their time and effort. So we developed using this information in this project to that garnered from this project to leverage our technicians on staff to really identify a checklist. These are the criteria that we need to proceed. And so when patients don't meet said criteria, they would be the ones outreaching on a consistent basis. So then that really, that patient cohort really needed that hand-holding through, because the laboratory monitoring or safety parameter monitoring is pretty inconsistent when it comes to IPF. So just having that consistent contact point, we've identified that leveraging our technicians, allowing them to work at the top of their license, really helped create a much more efficient process when managing this patient cohort.
Thank you guys so much for the input. Drew, I know you said you guys really targeted those disease states. Do you have an example you can share?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that we've noticed in the data is that, and this is a generality, but the more complex the therapy is clinically, the kind of the correlation with the slower turnaround time. And, that could be, home infusion, or as I mentioned earlier, loading doses, transitioning to more maintenance doses, complex weight-based dosing type of therapies as well. So one thing that we looked at was a lot of the e-prescribing that don't fit well with those, with those therapies, right? So we're having to do a lot of clarifications back to the office, back to the prescriber, to make sure we have all the required elements before we move forward. And then there's potentially more information that is needed for the PA and things like that. So we've worked on, we have a prescriber portal, and we've worked on building some customized referral flows through that portal, which will help kind of walk through step by step. Here are the elements we need for this complex disease state. Here's the elements that are going to be needed for the PA. And when we do see engagement on those customized flows, we do see faster turnaround time and quicker approvals of that prior authorization. Now, I will say that there's probably some eye rolling about, portals. There's lots of, portals out there, and there can be portal fatigue. But I know that certain prescribers are, may not be able to engage that way. They maybe have to go through their EMR system. But on the engagement we are seeing faster turnaround times, faster approvals. And I think it just points to what Ryan said. The easier you can make this on the patient side and the prescriber side, the faster we're going to be. And I look forward to the future when we're all connected, and the pharmacies, the providers, the EMRs, the PBMs and medical benefits is all connected, because I think there's a bright future there.
Absolutely, Drew. I think interoperability is something we hear a lot about, and there's a lot of talks, and looking forward to that future state. I'm going to keep it over here with you, Drew, and ask you, when you're thinking about what your organization learned through implementing the measure, are there any refinements to the measure specifications that you'd like us to consider?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I enjoyed the data. I enjoyed metrics, so I really enjoyed this project and digging in with you all and learning from my fellow panelists here too as well. And one thing that I mentioned is that we're focused on disease state. So I was really glad to see PQA include disease state indication flags in the metrics, so we could drill down and slice and dice the data by those disease states. I think an additional slicing of the data that would have been useful for us, and I think going forward, be I think you had it there in your slide, but the focus here is on new prescriptions. So not to get kind of too detailed into the world of pharmacy, but this is kind of like a first fill of a prescription, which largely are two buckets: a patient who's new to that therapy, right? Brand new to that therapy, or it could be a patient who's been on that therapy and is out of refills and needs a renewal prescription, right? So to me, those are two different patient populations that are going to behave very differently on turnaround time. So we recommended that we add a flag for, is this patient a new to therapy patient, or is they're continuing on the drug, but they're just needing a renewal prescription? Because a renewal prescription, and I think some folks mentioned earlier, like some nuances around capturing profile time. When we think about a renewal prescription, we're trying to get that renewal from the prescriber in time so we can fill the next fill before there's a gap in therapy. So to us, it doesn't, turnaround time only matters, to the point that we can get the patient their fill on time and avoid a gap in therapy. That's key there. For a new to therapy patient, we want to get them that therapy started as fast as possible. The clock is ticking. So I'd recommend a flag in the specifications so we can split those out and slice and dice and carve up our data and find root causes and go after improvement.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I think it's interesting anytime we can look at the data from a different perspective and learn something new. Heather, would you have any recommendations for the measure specs?
I do. So one opportunity I saw during the pilot was to better account for differences in some of the operating models between pharmacies, those that are open 7 days a week versus those that maybe are closed for weekends. The measure as it's drafted today removes weekend time, but my suggestion during the pilot was to consider stratifying the results by the operating model so that we're better comparing apples to apples, so to speak. And really, by doing so, we would also really focus on incentivizing being hyper-focused on patient care. And certainly this is also a health equity concern. The faster we can get the drug into the hands of the patient, for example, a mom of 3 that's working 2 jobs and really wants to come to the pharmacy on a weekend, we want to be able to do that. And certainly that's a keen area for Walgreens' focus.
Yeah, thank you. I think I resonate with that, Heather, as a working mom trying to figure out, okay, when can I drive For me right now, it's the closest pharmacy is 10 minutes away and not always feasible with a toddler in tow.
Exactly.
So to the others on our panel, any other suggestions for our measure specs?
Yeah, I can comment on, and I think we've kind of highlighted some of this. I think I'm really appreciative for the PQA team and really in putting some effort towards this. Right. I'm a data person, right? That's my whole role in in our operations team. So I deal with a lot of contract data requirements and making sure that we're submitting this stuff. It drives me crazy when we get these specs and I look at kind of what they're trying to they haven't given us any definition, but they're asking us for a turnaround time. And I'm like, what are you doing with this? How are you even comparing like us to other pharmacies? Because that's presumably what we're doing with this data. So it's really nice to have the definitions sort of a little more outlined. The only suggestion, I had a comment too on Drew's of the new versus renewal, right? There's a little bit of nuance there. I would also recommend just kind of continuing to look at making refinements on your measures and trying to figure out how do we continue to decrease the variability between sites that may have different operating models. So when you're relying on things that have to have some sort of calculated value, that makes it really challenging because we all have different systems, we all have different models, right, that we're working out of. And so that, the difference is when I have to calculate what I think one of our listeners here is kind of picked up on, like what's our use in actual time or delivery time. Those things matter, right, and how you're defining those. So just continuing to kind of look at, can we rely more on discrete data points that would be common throughout multiple systems. Now that's a hard task, and I understand that, and I'm not saying that's easy, but the more things that you have that are kind of variable or calculated values, I think the more variance you're going to have between reporting sites.
Yeah, and just to quickly add to what Ryan said, I think everybody's spot on. One of the challenges, and we certainly should look at delivery time, right? Turnaround time is all about when the patient actually has access to the medication. But as we were doing a deep dive, we noticed certain therapeutic classes had a quicker turnaround time just based on being cold chain and having to go overnight or same day delivery, right? So those are all nuances that I think we can certainly build into the model as we evolve.
Well, thank you guys so much. A lot to consider as we look at these specifications in more detail and figure out how can we further standardize it for folks. Mike, I'm going to toss it back to you, and then I'd like each of us on the panel to maybe say, what was one take-home lesson you got from this implementation pilot?
Well, the good news, Heather, is I have two. So, first I'll go back to communication, right? I think we identified an opportunity, perhaps a little too late internally, of how we could have improved at the individual level. But I also think there really is opportunity for everybody, no matter what your model is, to better communicate with the patients and the providers. And it really comes down to, we have bidirectional texting. We have free-form texting that we're using for our clinical teams. We have notifications that are just one way, and there's still an opportunity to improve on those. But I also think the best advice would be to challenge the status quo, right? I was new to specialty. Some things I wanted to change immediately. Some things I accepted because they seemed to be working, but perhaps they could have been working better. And, one example I'll give you is we're 100% employee-owned organization. So we look at things a little bit differently, including compensation. And we incentivize certain performance metrics within our team. And we identified as part of this process that we were heavily weighted on starting the prior authorization, but perhaps we're not as focused on the follow-up piece. So you can be very quick to start a prior auth, but if you're not following up with the same level of commitment, your results will not be as expected. So again, challenge status quo. I think every organization has something they're doing well. Could they be doing it better?
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm just going to kind of go by what I'm seeing on my screen. Maybe Johnny, Heather, Drew, and then Ryan.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, just to echo everyone's sentiment, there's still a lot of work to be done. Just a constant evaluation and reevaluation of our workflow as it's a constantly shifting landscape. Contract requirements, REMS requirements change and are very unique to each product, each disease state. So I think for us, in terms of our takeaway, is really fine-tuning the workflows and processes on a disease state specific level to allow that optimal patient care delivery, right? Because I talk about an encompassing model. Again, and there's a question in the Q&A section here that talked about, well, are we measuring the time to delivery? Because we can turn it around within less than a day, but if the courier delays delivery, then that delay ultimately delays treatment to the patient. So how can we shore that up? How can we ensure that patients have their medications in hand? What can we do on the front end of that to really facilitate that process? So it is a lot of breakdown in terms of communication, especially those more complex diseases or higher acuity disease states that require a lot of the safety parameters, right? Working a lot more closely with our physicians and prescribers with managing all those processes and those key checklist points in the REMS processes. So ushering them through and guiding them through that process really helps facilitate that and minimizes that time with at least what we can do in the specialty pharmacy realm. Thank you.
So I think I have two takeaways as well. The first is always keep coming back to being hyper-focused on patients and quality care. So I think if that mantra trumps everything, we're going to be okay as an industry. The second would be understanding each factor affecting the actual measure, whether it's the measurement itself or the quality of the care that's being driven. So trying to tease out the difference between whether this is a measurement issue or an actual operational one.
Was I next, Heather?
Yeah, you're next.
So, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I would agree with everything that was just said, and I would maybe echo a little bit what Heather said, and I'd say that the metric is going to point you in the right direction, right? It's not going to tell you why, right, or how, but it's going to tell you here's where you may have an issue, right, and that's where you really got to dig in and slice at it. And I like what Heather said. Yeah, if we put the patient first, everything else seems to fall in line. So do what's right for the patient, put that first, and then everything else falls in line. So yeah, I love the data. Maybe sometimes I get, like Ryan, I get too fixated on the data, but I think where I want to dig in a little bit more on internally is being able to readily identify the why, right? As a product person, I want to know the why so I can figure out a solution to move forward.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly. I mean, it's spot on, right, with other folks. I think, we found out, right, we probably need to do a better job at understanding, and Heather was kind of making this point of, is this an actual patient issue, right? Or is this just a calculation issue? So we've got to do a better job in figuring out how to define profile versus pending, right? Like are we putting them in the right bucket according to everything, and how are we getting that data out? More to Drew's point of like, now what do we do about the data, right? And I think we continue to kind of see changes. One thing I always tell my students is specialty pharmacy is great, right? As long as you want a career, right, where you're not going to get too comfortable, specialty will be great for you, because you're never going to hit that sort of status quo where we can just drift. Something's changing every single day in this world. And so one of the things, right, that we've noticed recently is these things, and I don't want to get too controversial on here, but like copay maximizers and accumulators, and kind of how that affects overall like patient turnaround time. It used to be just the first script was the hard one to get out the door, but then it can be almost every script, right? Gets really challenging to get out the door. And so it's been interesting kind of looking at our data, right, and seeing, gosh, do we need to make operational changes? to Drew's point, we really didn't worry about a whole lot on the back end after that first script. Like, you were on coast at that point, right? We just kept the PAs up and kept up the financial assistance. But I think we're finding through these turnaround metrics of, gosh, we probably do need to do a better job in sort of monitoring even after that first fill, because there are things that are happening within the market, right, that are sort of changing the dynamics on what we've historically considered our focus with turnaround time.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing all your insights. Looking at the time, I think we're going to go ahead and turn over to some of the Q&A that we're seeing in the chat. The first question I see, are these measures also taking into account time to pick up or actual delivery, not only if the medication is ready, but if it's actually received by the patient? And so I could take that one since I'm part of the measure development team. This was discussed by our technical expert panel during development, and the multi-stakeholder panel really did feel strongly that the measure should reflect what is within the specialty pharmacy's control and ability to impact. And so our TAT landed on the turnaround time endpoint being ready for pickup or scheduled for delivery. Actual delivery date to the patient, for example, might be dependent on when the patient is available to receive that delivery, and not necessarily reflective of the specialty pharmacy's ability to actually have the prescription ready for the patient. And so just a little background into some of our decision making, but do echo what others say, that it's still really important to ensure patients actually get the medications once they are ready. And there's certainly a lot of things that they can do to, help ensure that, especially if there are barriers preventing a patient from picking up. And I also see another question that I'd like to pose to the panel. How are turnaround times affected when a patient has a recurring prescription for a drug that cannot be stopped abruptly? Are there ways to streamline turnaround time in situations when the patient is in acute need of the medication? So I don't know who wants to take that one.
Yeah, I can start or take an attempt at my interpretation of the question. I'm sure others can weigh in, but it sounds like potentially there's a need to shift the drug to another one. Probably I'm reading into it in the same category. So there's like a refill too soon edit kind of hitting is what I'm potentially interpreting. But what I'd say is that, yes, this is where that communication comes in between provider and pharmacy, right? So here's what, we can have that communication. Here's what I want to do. We can run test claims on our side and communicate back. This is what we're getting, right? We may need the provider's assistance in resolving some of those. If they're saying, hey, this is urgent, I have to change the drug. I will say that in general, those types of edits, if it's a fairly common or urgent as described here, they really shouldn't be in place. So if you see something like that looks like there shouldn't be that type of edit, I'd be happy to, you can email me that and I'd be happy to look into it from our perspective. But I think this is where that communication comes in, and it's not always going to be, to Ryan's point, this is where, specialty pharmacy always keeps it interesting, right? This is where we have to work together and find solutions for the nuances. But I'd open it up to the group for their interpretation.
Yeah, so I read that a little bit quickly, or maybe even differently, and may not be accurate either, but I read that as, it's in the normal course, it's a refill, and maybe the patient waited too long, or the pharmacy didn't engage the patient soon enough, and you have to get it to them quickly. But normal processes, including, clinical assessment, things of that nature, may delay it. From our standpoint, on the refill side, we reach out to the patients really early, 7 to 10 days in advance, either manually or digitally based on their preference. And there are certain things that add to that process, right? Is this product under enhanced services? Do we have a clinical protocol? So if the patient indicates that, they have an extreme need, we'll determine what we can suspend and move the product forward and ship, and then follow up with the patient later, providing that that patient is committed to connecting with us. So we do have certain parts of our protocol that we can suspend to improve turnaround time. But again, we try to keep that the exception, not the rule.
I agree, Mike. I think that's the same, that's the way I read the question as well. And it really does mean early. I mean, ultimately, it breaks down to early bird gets the worm. We also reach out to our more complex cohorts 7 to 10 days prior to their due date, so that we can remove all the possible barriers to receiving that patient, or I'm sorry, the prescription delivery time. So yeah, looking at that, outreaching to the prescriber well ahead of time. So we try to minimize or mitigate the need for any kind of abrupt the prescriptions. But we always run to those factors of, hey, I'm going out of country tomorrow. Where's my prescription? So those are the situations where we always encourage. Now, this is this patient education piece where we always let the patients know that there are processes that we need to go through in order to safely provide this medication. So just having that transparency to our patients and our prescribers, so that they are working in tandem to provide timely care.
Thanks, Johnny. I think I see you're off mute, Heather. So I'll let you chime in and then we'll go back to the slides.
Yeah, I think similar to everyone else's comments, I would just say I interpreted this as refill as well. And I would say to me, there's a balance between a new to treat patient, right, which has maybe special needs, compared to what we would considering a continuing patient, which is more of an adherence program. And I think we started the conversation early on about saying that communication with the patient is via multiple different channels is really important. Being able to have proactive communications early on in the process, and also having multiple channels by which you can outreach to them, I think have been some of our success factors at Walgreens.
Yeah, and I will add one more thing, and it's not always popular, but I think there's always the financial question, right? The patient may need the medication before the copay assistance or the financial situation has been resolved. And you always have to look at that from a professional standpoint. There are times where you just have to trust in the system and make sure the patient stays on therapy and work it out afterwards.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists today. This was a really great discussion, and I know our members that joined us today really got a lot out of it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and do a little bit of wrap up. But once again, a big round of applause to our panelists that joined us here today. Really enjoyed the conversation that we had. So if you haven't got enough of specialty pharmacy turnaround time and you want to know some more, you can go ahead and check out our blog on the PQA website, piloting the PQA specialty pharmacy turnaround time quality measure. You can also join us in person at the NASP 2024 annual meeting and expo in Nashville, Tennessee. Our presentation will occur on October 8th at 4:30 p.m. Central Time. And the session title is Piloting a Specialty Pharmacy Turnaround Time Quality Measure, Findings and Lessons Learned. So please attend our session, give us your feedback, and do say hello. We're always excited to see folks when we are out and about. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Amanda for some PQA announcements and closing remarks. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you again for our panel for joining us today. I did drop a couple of things in chat about that blog and the NASP meeting that Heather was just referring to. So have a look at those. I'm going to drop a couple other things in chat that I'm going to share with you about now as well. So we're going to close up today with sharing some information about what's coming up here at PQA. First and foremost, registration is now open for 2 events, our PQA Convenes and the 2024 PQA Leadership Summit. Both of those events are going to be held this year in Arlington, Virginia. The PQA Convenes is going to take place on November the 7th, and it will bring leaders in the rare disease community together to discuss quality medication use. And then the Leadership Summit will immediately follow that event, and it will take place on November 7th and 8th. And it will focus on PQA's recent and ongoing work to develop standard pharmacy quality measures. We have registration information that we have sent to key contacts for the PQA member organizations. But if you do have questions for us about either the PQA Convenes or the PQA Leadership Summit, please feel free to email us. I did drop that email in chat. It is meetings@pqaalliance.org, and we do look forward to seeing you in Arlington. And then next, the call for breakout session and poster abstract proposals are both open for the 2025 PQA annual meeting. That meeting is going to take place May 19th through 21st in Tampa, Florida. And we do have two different due dates. The first due date is Tuesday, November the 12th for breakout session proposals. So you got a couple of months to put those together. And then our second due date is Friday, January the 10th for poster abstract proposals. You can submit a proposal and find out more information about these opportunities at the link I have posted in chat. And then our next Quality Forum webinar will be held on Thursday, October the 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Our topic will be leveraging pharmacists through an AMA program to improve blood pressure control. And PQA is grateful to PerformRx for supporting that webinar and for supporting PQA throughout the year. You can once again register for the webinar using the link that is available in chat. And then finally, please save the date for us for our next stakeholder advisory meeting. That's going to take place on Wednesday, October the 23rd. That's also at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Registration information will be available for PQA member organizations as we get closer to that webinar. And we do look forward to seeing you there. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.